notes. The Heart of the River Coalition was formed in April of 2013, so we're almost 2 years old. The Heart of the River was announced in response to a plan by the Anderson Corporation for Economic Development, as you folks know, to build a dam and flood about an 8-mile strip of land in Madison and Delaware County, inundating, among other things, at least 1/3 of Mound State Park, which sits directly across the river from this beautiful site where we're meeting today. Heart of the River has hosted panels designed to educate the community about some of the realities of this, what I affectionately call the dam reservoir proposal. We have hosted events celebrating the river. We continue to speak to various governing bodies in the area about our concerns, and we welcome you to join us. Many of you we know are our friends and neighbors and are our co-collaborators, and we would welcome you to be more active part of this movement. But today, mostly, we're gathering to enjoy an afternoon of music, of fellowship, of Scott Sanders reading from his work Celebrating the River and Celebrating the Natural World. And so after Carol does another piece for us, we will welcome him. Thanks for being here. Scott Russell Sanders was born in Memphis, Tennessee. He was born in Memphis, Tennessee. His father came from a family of cotton farmers in Mississippi, his mother from an immigrant doctor's family in Chicago. He spent his early childhood in Tennessee, and he spent his school years in Ohio. He studied physics and English, something of a Renaissance man, I suppose, at Brown University, and with the aid of a Marshall Scholarship, went on to pursue graduate work at Cambridge University, where he completed a PhD in English in 1971. From 1971 until his retirement in 2009, he taught at Indiana University, and from 95 onward, he served as the Distinguished Professor of English there. Among his more than 20 books are novels, collections of stories, works of personal nonfiction, including Staying Put, Writing from the Center, and Hunting for Hope. His recent books include A Private History of Awe, a coming-of-age memoir, Love Story and Spiritual Testament, a conservationist manifesto, his vision of a shift from a culture of consumption to a culture of caretaking. Oh, don't we need that? And Earthworks, a selection of his best essays from the past 30 years. His latest book is the novel Divine Animal, A Story of Healing. Mr. Sanders is currently at work on a collection of short stories, a children's musical, and a book about the meaning of wealth. His writing examines the human place in nature, the pursuit of social justice, the relation between culture and geography, and the search for a spiritual path. He and his wife, Ruth, a biochemist, have reared 2 children in their hometown of Bloomington in the Hardwood Hill country of Indiana's White River Valley. Please welcome Scott Russell.
Thank you. My wife is at a quilting retreat this weekend at Spring Mill State Park, so I'm up here solo. My voice is raspy because I woke up this morning with a cold. I don't know where that came from, so I apologize beforehand. I don't usually sound this froggy, and I've got a cough drop in my mouth at the moment. Well, I would think that the proposal to build this reservoir and flood 1/3 of Mountain State Park and the whole riparian belt of the White River through this corridor and force 400 families out of their homes, I would think that that was just such an outrageously stupid idea that there was no prospect of it coming to reality. But I know better. There are 75,000 dams in the United States, according to the Army Corps of Engineers tally, which probably doesn't get all of them, but that's the best estimate we have, 75,000. There were good reasons for some of them, flood control. Some of them do provide reservoirs where there isn't a rich source of groundwater as there is right here. Some of them provide hydroelectric power. But at least 2/3 of them are just boondoggles. They were ways that a small number of people in any given case made a lot of money. Not just in the construction process, although there is a $400 million dam project, there's a lot of money made hauling concrete and gravel and other supplies. There's also more money to be made in managing and selling real estate. So this is one more conflict between private greed and public good. And this is a conflict that's going on across our country in countless ways. The privatizing of our public schools, the privatizing of our prisons, the privatizing of our military. So this struggle over whether the future of this river valley will be, what's that back there? Something's, the ice machine, okay. So this is part of a national struggle to defend the public interest against private greed. Another reason I know that as outrageous as this proposal for a dam here is, the reason I know its outrageousness does not guarantee that it will not come to pass is because the land I grew up on in Portage County in northeastern Ohio was put under a boondoggle dam reservoir. I grew up along the west branch of the Mahoning River. in a county that already had 3 reservoirs and a very thin population. There was never any rationale given for another reservoir except that a bunch of developers wanted it built. Our home was claimed, and we were forced to move, and the house was torn down, our barn was torn down. And the issue was not how much money our family received for the property. The issue was we had no choice about selling the property. The dam was built, and a valley that was rich with history, with ancient trees, especially maples, sugar bushes all up that valley, and farms. That valley was dammed. By the time the water had backed up, my family had moved away, I had gone off to college, and it was some years before I came back to that place. I knew in my head that that childhood place, just like where we are right now, I knew in my head that that place was underwater, as this place where we are at this moment would be if that dam were built. I knew that in my head, but I didn't really know it in my heart. I didn't know it in my chest. Until about 8 or 9 years after the water had backed up, I had occasion to go back through that part of Ohio, and I decided I'd go have a look. And here's just a little excerpt from an essay about that. It's an essay called After the Flood. My mind raced along the road as I remembered it, steeply downhill between fat maples and patchy sycamores to the river and the steel-girdered bridge. I had rolled down that hill in a school bus, swayed down on horseback, hurtled down on bicycle and sled, run down on foot. The slope and the feel of it fixed inside me became my standard for all hills. From the bridge, I had watched the river's current raveling over sandbars, minnows flickering in the shallows, water striders dimpling the surface. Now and again, when the sun was right, I had spied my own face peering up from the stream. In memory, the road stretched on beyond the bridge, passing the tin-roofed shed where the maple syrup boiled, passing the Civvies farm, rising up the far slope to a T-junction with the Ridgeline Road. Turn left from there and I would go to the high school. Turn right and I would go to the barber shop and feed store. As my thoughts raced ahead of the car, inside me the valley opened and the river flexed its long, sleek muscle. Rounding the curve, however, I had to slam on the brakes to avoid running into a guardrail that blocked the road. Beyond the railing, where valley and bridge and river should have been, flat gray water spread away toward distant hills. I got out of the car and pressed my thighs against the cold steel barricade and stared. Gray, flat, empty lake, not even a boat to redeem the emptiness. A lone crow slowly pumped toward the horizon on glossy black wings. Along the shore, a few sycamores still thrust up their mottled branches. Except for those trees, the pavement beneath my boots, and hills too high for water to claim, everything I knew had been swept away. My worst imaginings had failed to prepare me for this. I stood there dazed. I could not take it in, so much had been taken away. For a long spell, I leaned against the guardrail and dredged up everything I could remember of what lay beneath the reservoir. But memory was at last defeated by the blank gray water. No effort of mind could restore the river or drain the valley. I surrendered to what my eyes were telling me. Only then was I truly exiled. We Euro-Americans, which is what most of us in this room are, have a long history of exiling people from their land. It began, of course, with the native people. The word Indiana means land of Indians. By 1830, the only Indians left in Indiana were a few people who were hiding out in grave danger, including the people whose land this was. On your tables, there's a quote from an essay of mine called Buckeye, and I'm not going to read that whole quote, but it's about this river that I just mentioned. And the key word there, well, here's the start of it. Most of the rivers in my part of Ohio had been dammed, turning fertile valleys into scummy playgrounds for boats. Now, of course, also for jet skis, an abomination that hadn't been invented at the time I wrote this. One free-flowing river, the Mahoning, ran past the small farm where our family lived during my later years in Ohio. We owned just enough land to pasture 3 ponies and to grow vegetables for our table, but those few acres opened onto miles of woods and creeks and secret meadows. I walked that land in every season, every weather, following animal trails. But then the Mahoning, too, was doomed. We were forced to sell our land, and a dam began to rise across the river. And here's the key sentence. If enough people had spoken for the river, we might have saved it. The only thing to put up against greed is love. Love for something other than money. In 1 Timothy in the New Testament, a book that's often, from the Bible, the book that's often cited by people who seem to regard money as more important than anything else. From 1 Timothy, there's a famous verse. It says, the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not money that's the root of all evil. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And that is what's at stake here. There is a conflict between a small group of people who love money so much that they would destroy things that everybody, or I trust just about everybody in this room, loves deeply. Plants, animals, free-flowing water, clean water, beauty. And none of those things should be sold. Well, the love of rivers goes very deep in American culture, American history, and we know the native people loved them. But unfortunately, in our state, we have very, very little record of what they thought, of their songs, of their stories. So I'll start with a European-American, John James Audubon. He's famous, of course, for the paintings of birds. But when he published the portraits of birds, he published along with them a number of essays. And one of those essays is about the Ohio River. And here's a little excerpt from the Ohio River essay. It's a little formal. It wasn't actually the way Audubon wrote. He was a native speaker of French, and he never spoke yet or English very grammatically. So it's a little flowery because he had help from an editor in Scotland. It was in the month of October. He and his wife were going down the river from Cincinnati. They were heading towards Henderson, Kentucky. It was the month of October. The autumnal tints already decorated the shores of that queen of rivers, the Ohio. Every tree was hung with long and flowing festoons of different species of vines, many loaded with clustered fruits of varied brilliancy. Their rich, bronzed color mingled beautifully with the yellow foliage, which now predominated over the yet green leaves, reflecting more lively tints from the clear stream than ever landscape painter portrayed or poet imagined. Nature, in her varied arrangements, seems to have felt a partiality towards this portion of our country. As the traveler ascends or descends the Ohio River, he cannot help remarking that alternately, nearly the whole length of the river, the margin on one side is bounded by lofty hills and a rolling surface, while on the other, Extensive plains of the richest alluvial land are seen as far as the eye can command the view. Islands of varied size and form rise here and there from the bosom of the water, and the winding course of the stream frequently brings you to places where the idea of being on a river of great length changes. Some of these islands are of considerable size and value, while others, small and insignificant, seem as if intended for contrast. These little islands are frequently overflowed during great floods and receive at their heads prodigious heaps of drifted timber. And then just one other line. It talks about how there are more and more clearings along the sides of the river, little homesteads. So he's writing this in about 1820. So almost 200 years ago. And he says, when I see the surplus population of Europe coming to assist in the destruction of the forest and transplanting civilization into its darkest recesses, when I remember that these extraordinary changes have all taken place in the short period of 20 years, I pause, wonder, and although I know all to be fact, can scarcely believe its reality. Whether these changes are for the better or for the worse, I shall not pretend to say, but in whatever way my conclusions may incline, I feel with regret that there are on record no satisfactory accounts of the state of that portion of the country from the time when our people first settled in it. Well, when European Americans first came to the place we now call Indiana, about 85% of it was old-growth hardwood forest. Some of that forest was also wetlands. A significant fraction, especially the northern third of the state, were wetlands. And in the northwestern corner of the state, there were thousands upon thousands of acres of prairie. We've now plowed all but a tiny fraction of the prairies. We've now drained all but a tiny fraction of the wetlands. We've now cut down all but a few pockets of the old-growth woods. We wouldn't be in this room, we wouldn't have roads, we wouldn't have been able to come here if the landscape had not been altered. The question is not whether the land should be altered. The question is whether there is ever a point at which we say, that's enough. Let's quit cutting trees in our state forests. Let's quit draining wetlands and let's restore wetlands. Let's quit damming rivers. Indiana has, and this is a surprise to many people, the smallest percentage of its land base in public lands of any state east of the Mississippi River. It's mainly because so much of it can be farmed. We adore our state parks, our state forests, the one federal forest, the Hoosier, the lands that groups like the Red Tail Land Trust, Sycamore Land Trust, where I come from, Central Indiana Land Trust, Acres, so many good land trusts in Indiana. We treasure the parcels that these organizations have protected, but still, we have so little public land in this state. And to take any portion of it, as this dam would do, and turn it into a reservoir covered with jet skis and motorboats and parked around by trailers would be an abomination. You've heard of a guy named Mark Twain. Well, before he became Mark Twain, he was a river pilot, and he got his name. His real name, of course, was Samuel Clemens, and he took his name, Mark Twain, from one of the shouts that the people who were measuring the depth of the river would give. And one of those was when there were two measures, Mark Twain. Here's a little excerpt from Mark Twain's memoir, really, called Life on the Mississippi. It's not a novel. It's about his days as a cub pilot on the Mississippi River. As I have said, the big rise, this was a time of flood, the big rise brought a new world under my vision. By the time the river was over its banks, we had forsaken our old paths and were hourly climbing over bars that had stood 10 feet out of the water before. We were shaving stumpy shores. Some of these chutes were utter solitudes. The dense, untouched forest overhung both banks of the crooked little crack, and one could believe that human creatures had never intruded there before. The swinging grapevines, the grassy nooks and vistas glimpsed as we swept by, the flowering creepers waving their red blossoms from the tops of dead trunks, and all the spendthrift richness of the forest foliage were wasted and thrown away here. Wasted only because there were so few people to see them. And here's a description of dawn on the Mississippi River from Huckleberry Finn, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So this is the voice of Huckleberry, who had a much better version of it than I'm going to give you, but this is the best I can do with this, with this cold. So he's on the raft, coming down the river with Jim, the escaped slave. Here's the way we put in the time. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We run nights and laid up and hid daytimes. As soon as night was most gone, we stopped navigating and tied up, nearly always in the dead water under a towhead, and then cut young cottonwoods and willows and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the lines for fish. We set out the lines. Next, we slid into the river and had a swim so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee-deep and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywheres, perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep, only sometimes the bullfrogs a-cluttering maybe. The first thing to see, looking away over the water, was a kind of dull line. That was the woods on the other side. You couldn't make nothing else out. Then a pale place in the sky, then more paleness spreading around. Then the river softened up way off and weren't black anymore, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you could hear a squeak, squeaking, or jumbled up voices. It was so still, and sounds come so far. And by, you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there's a snag there and a swift current which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And you see the mist curl up off of the water, and the east reddens up and the river, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods, away on the bank on the other side of the river, being a wood yard likely, and piled by them cheats so you can throw a dog through it anywhere. Then the nice breeze springs up and comes fanning you from over there, so cool and fresh and sweet to smell, on account of the woods and the flowers, but sometimes not that way because they've left dead fish laying around, gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. And next, you've got the full day and everything smiling in the sun and the songbirds just going it. Don't you want to get on the river? Well, how many people in this room have heard of Harlan Hubbard? Look for a book. It's hard to find, but maybe your library will have it. Look for a book called Shanty Boat. It's one word, Shanty Boat. It's just like a little homemade houseboat with no motor. It just drifts down the river. And he and his wife lived in one for a long time on the Ohio and eventually settled in a little pocket of land on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. I love Harlan Hubbard. This new novel of mine I brought along with me called Divine Animal. The male protagonist, there's also a couple female protagonists, but the male protagonist is named Harlan for this man. Anyway, I love Harlan Hubbard. And here's an excerpt from his book, Shanty Boat. A river tugs at whatever is within reach, trying to set it afloat and carry it downstream. Living trees are undermined and washed away. No piece of driftwood is safe, though stranded high up the bank. The river will rise to it, and away it will go. The river extends this power of drawing all things with it, even to the imagination of those who live on its banks. Who can long watch the ceaseless lapsing of a river's current without conceiving a desire to set himself adrift and, like the driftwood which glides past, float with the stream clear to the final ocean? With me, the attraction of flowing water goes back as far as I can remember. I want to read that sentence again, because that is absolutely true of me, and probably a lot of people in this room. With me, the attraction of flowing water goes back as far as I can remember. My river is the Ohio, whose channel from the first has borne the dreams of men from the old and known to the new and strange. The early voyages were made in quest of a golden fleece, which to some meant a new, free land in the West, to others a better market in the South for their homemade and homegrown products. To these men, the river was first of all a means of transportation. Some of them must have loved the river for its own sake, or learned to love it, for they made repeated voyages downstream, selling boats and cargoes in the south and toiling overland back to their starting place, like boys dragging their sleds uphill to coast down again. The true shanty boater has a purer love for the river than had his drifting flatboat predecessors. They were concerned with trade or new land. To him, the shanty boater, the river is more than a means of livelihood. It's a way of life, the only one he knows, which answers his innate longing to be untrammeled and independent, to live on the fringe of society. His drifting downstream is as natural to him as his growing old in the stream of time. Away from the river, he languishes as if taken from his natural element. It is to be regretted that the race of shanty boaters is dying out. Today you are likely to find even an active fisherman living in a house on land or in a trailer. Those who still live on the water have motorboats to shove their fleet upstream and down too, so that the art of drifting is forgotten. The younger generation seem to have interests away from the river. They will never be able to tell the tales their granddads can. I cultivated the acquaintance of old-time river people whenever possible and listened to their yarns almost with reverence. The simplicity and naturalness of their way of living fascinated me and gave a definite shape to the vague longing which the flowing river had inspired. And two more. The next to last one is from my greatest living hero, and a man whose work many, many people in this room know, I'm sure, and that's Wendell Berry. And this is from an essay of Wendell's called The Rise, about a flood in the Kentucky River. The farm he and his wife Tanya live on is on a slope hill farm overlooking the Kentucky River, not too far from its mouth. And he and a friend, he never names the friend, but he and a friend go out on the river in the rise. And this is his account of that, just a little excerpt. It was a gray, cold Sunday in the middle of December. In the woods on the north slopes above us, we could see the black trunks and branches, just faintly traced with snow, which gave them a silvery, delicate look, the look of impossibly fine handwork that nature sometimes has. And they looked cold. The wind was coming straight up the river into our faces, but we were dressed warmly and the wind didn't matter much, at least not yet. The force that mattered, that surrounded us and inundated us with its sounds and pulled at or shook or carried everything around us, was the river. Still Wendell Berry. Same essay. It is illuminating and suitably humbling to a man to recognize the great power of the river. But after he has recognized its power, he is next called upon to recognize its limits. It can neither swallow up nor carry off all the trash that people convenience themselves by dumping into it. It can't carry off harmlessly all the sewage and pesticides and industrial contaminants that we are putting into it now, much less all that we will be capable of putting into it in a few years. We haven't accepted, we don't really believe that the most characteristic product of our age of scientific miracles is junk. But that is so. And we still think and behave as though we face an unspoiled continent with thousands of acres of living space for every man, woman, and child. We still sing America the Beautiful as though we had not created in it by strenuous effort, at great expense, and with dauntless self-praise and unprecedented ugliness. The last couple of miles of our trip, we could hear off in the bottoms alongside us the cries of pileated woodpeckers, and we welcomed the news of them. These belong to the big trees and big woods, and more than any other birds along this river, they speak out of our past. Their voices are loud and wild, the cries building strongly and then trailing off arrhythmically and hesitantly as though reluctant to end. Though they never seemed very near, we could hear them clearly over the commotion of the water. There were probably only a pair or two of them, but their voices kept coming to us a long time, creating beyond the present wildness of the river, muddy from the ruin of mountainsides and farmlands, the intimation of another wildness that will not overflow again in our history. The wind had finally made its way into our clothes, and our feet and hands and faces were beginning to stiffen a little with the cold. And so when home came back in sight, we thought it wasn't too soon. We began to slant across the currents toward the shore. The river didn't stop to let us off. We ran the bow out onto the path that goes up to my house, and the current rippled on past the stern as though it were no more than the end of a stranded log. We were out of it, wobbling off, stiff-legged along the midrib on our way to the high ground. With the uproar of the water still in our ears, we had, as we entered the house, the sense of having been utterly outside the lives we live as usual. My warm living room was a place we seemed to have been away from a long way. It needed getting used to. And then the last excerpt is from my book, Staying Put. And it's an essay called The Force of Moving Water. And it's mainly about the Ohio, although it starts with some references to the Mississippi River, because I was born within half a mile of the Mississippi River in Memphis. The river I have come to know most familiarly, the river that winds through the center of my imagination as it winds through my region, is the Ohio. I was born next to a larger one, the great brown flood into which the Ohio pours, the old man himself, the Mississippi. I remember dragging a gunny sack behind me down the rows of cotton in a field near Memphis when I was a toddler, not much taller than the bushes. Remember coming to the steep bank of a levee, climbing to the top, and then finding spread before me the mile-wide muddy water. It might have been an ocean for all I could see of the far shore. The very earth seemed to have turned liquid. I knew what it was, of course, because the slick brown river was my most famous neighbor, the father of waters. I knew stories about the way it sometimes stirred in its bed and cut a new channel or snatched houses and trees and unwary toddlers in its wet claws. I could even spell its long, snaky name, chanting the jingle, M-I-S-S-I-S-S-I-P-P-I. Looking out over that rolling flood from the levee, I was mesmerized and terrified. Rivers still affect me that way. Anybody who is not a bit scared by a river has either not looked at a real one or not looked hard enough. Chances are your own life and the history of your place are braided with the current of a river as my life and place are braided with the Ohio. When we figure our addresses, we might do better to forget zip codes and consider where the rain goes after it falls outside our windows. We need such knowledge, need to feel as intimate with the branching and gathering of the earth's veins as we do with the veins in our own wrists. The tilt of land that snares the rain also defines where we are more profoundly than any state line or city limit. States often draw their borders along rivers, yet that is false to the land because rivers join rather than divide their two shores. My rumpled neighborhood in southern Indiana has more to do with the hill country across the river in Kentucky than it does with the glacial plains of northern Indiana. Nature ignores our political boundaries. Birds migrate up and down the valleys, seeds ride the currents, plants colonize outward from the banks, and all manner of beasts, including humans, seek homes and food and one another along the paths of rivers. A true map of our continent would show a pattern of curving watersheds stitched together along high ridges like a paisley fabric. And then this is the last excerpt. Riverness. See that some of that got the title for that. I think that's a word I invented. Maybe somebody else has said it, but if you teach English, you get to invent words. Every English teacher knows when you come to the name of a character in a book and you really don't know how it's pronounced, you don't know if it's an unusual name, you just say it really firmly, and then your students assume that you know what you're talking about. So Riverness. You know, Riverness, right? Riverness, the appeal of a river, the way it speaks to us, has to do with our craving for a sense of direction within the seeming randomness of the world. Narrative offers us the same pleasure, a shape and direction imposed on time. And so we tell stories and listen to them as we listen to the coursing of water. One night, I was telling my children stories about the Ohio. They were still young enough to sit still when Daddy told stories. Now they tell stories to their own children, so this is quite a while ago. One night, I was telling stories to my children about the Ohio. We were in Cincinnati's riverfront park, sitting on the curved, stair-stepped levee they call the Serpentine Wall. It is the right shape for the river, the shape of the snaky brown god. I am glad the wall is there, a wise and handsome creation, a sign of what we can do when we have our wits about us. Tires wind overhead on the meshwork of a bridge, the same one from which, as a boy of 5, I had first glimpsed the Ohio. Behind us, kids waded, squealing in fountains, and in front of us, a dozen roaring boats crisscrossed the river. Eva and Jesse, my children, Eva and Jesse had heard the stories before, but they indulged me by pretending every word was news. I told them how the tusks of mammoths discovered at Big Bone Lick were ground up to make fertilizer. I told them about river catfish weighing more than the anglers who caught them, about hollow sycamores large enough to shelter families, about floods that lifted cows through the second-story windows of a Louisville hotel. I told them how in the days before sonar and radar, travelers estimated their distance from shore in darkness or fog by heaving stones and listening for a splash or a thud. I told them how the northern shore, the shore where we made our home, had been known for a century as the Indian side, and how slaves crossed the river by night on their way to freedom, and how steamships raced with their safety valves tied down, how pirates infested the cliffs of Illinois, and how in spring the thawing ice grumbled like cannon fire. I rattled on because I wanted my children to grow up carrying the Ohio in their minds. Then after a while, I realized that like tourists and speculators, I was not speaking of the river, but of us two-legged wonders. So I shut up. And as the darkness thickened, traffic thinned on the bridge, boats put in for shore, the fountains stopped sputtering, and the waiters went home. Eventually there came a moment when the only sound was the shudder of the great, muscular dragon body slithering in its bed. And that was the truest speech about the river. Thank you.
Some people want to dive right in, feel the water bless their skin. Some people want to wait on shore, watching they don't know what for. Sometimes the water's rough, sometimes the water's cold. Sometimes we build a boat so we can row that endless river, endless river, endless river, flowing free. It goes on forever, endless river. Here's your part. We're all a part of it. We're all a part of it. We're all a part of it. You and me. Some people want to build a dam, turn it all to plots and plans. Some people just ride the waves, they toss and turn between the fates. Sometimes the water's deep, sometimes the water dries. Our soul can go to sleep if we don't try to save that river, endless river, endless river, flowing free. It goes on forever, endless river, and we're all a part of it. We're all a part of it. We're all a part of it, you and me. Endless river, endless river, endless river, flowing free. Endless river, flowing to eternity. Endless river, endless river, endless river, flowing free. Endless river, flowing to eternity. That endless river, endless river, endless river, flowing free. It goes on forever, endless river, and we're all a part of it. We're all a part of it. We're all a part of it. Couple more times. We're all a part of it. We're all a part of it. One more time. We're all a part of it. Every time. We're all a part of it. You and me.
We didn't write this one. This one was by a group you may or may not have heard of called Mamuse, Anyone heard of them? Oh, goody. I mean, we wrote this. Ready? Don't do that. Don't do that. All right. It's very annoying. Ready? When time I feel this way, this old familiar sinking, I will lay my troubles down by the water, where the river will never run dry. Hallelujah. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. By and by, I will lay my troubles down by the waters, where the river will never run dry. It's been said, and I do believe, as you ask, so shall you receive. So take from me these troubles, bring me sweet release, where the river will never run dry. Hallelujah. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. By and by, I will lay my troubles down by the waters, where the river will never run dry. There is a river in this heart of mine, with the knowingness of my highest good. I am willing, I will do my part, where the river will never run dry. Hallelujah. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. I'm gonna let myself be lifted. By and by, I will lay my troubles down by the water, where the river will never run dry. Where the river will never run dry. This river